There is a silence that follows the death of a great man. It is not an empty silence. It is a heavy, profound quiet, filled with the echo of a voice you will never hear again, the ghost of a laugh that used to shake the very foundations of your world. For the past week, since my husband Richard passed, I have been living in that silence. Our home, once a vibrant hub of strategy and life, has become a museum of his absence. Each room holds a memory, each object a story, and I, the curator of it all, have been walking through the halls of my own heart, lost in a grief so vast it felt like a universe of cold, silent stars. My husband was a titan. To the world, Richard Vance was a brilliant, often ruthless CEO who built a financial empire from the ground up. But to me, he was the man who still brought me a cup of tea in bed every morning, the man who would hum off key while he read the stock market reports, the man whose hand I had held for 45 years. We were not just husband and wife, we were partners in everything. While he was the public face, the architect of our success, I was his silent counsel, his strategist, the one person in the world who could tell him when he was wrong and to whom he would always listen. Our life was a long, intricate, and beautiful conversation, and now I was left with only silence. Through it all, my children, Ethan and Isabel, had been a present. They had flanked me at the funeral, their faces composed in masks of appropriate sorrow. Ethan, my son, at 45, wore his grief like he wore his expensive tailored suits. It looked good, but it didn't seem to fit him comfortably. Isabel, my daughter, at 42, was better at the performance. She managed her sorrow with a chilling efficiency, arranging flowers, greeting guests, her grief a well-managed project. They were playing the parts of devoted children, but their performance lacked the one thing that would have made it real: genuine comfort. I saw the way Ethan's eyes kept drifting to the large, empty chair behind Richard's desk in the study. I saw the way Isabel would subtly direct the conversation with condoling guests towards the future of the company and the stability of the Vance legacy. They were mourning a CEO. I was mourning my husband. The day after the last of the relatives had departed, they arrived at the house together. It was a gray, drizzly morning that perfectly matched the mood of my heart. "Mother," Ethan said, his voice a low, serious baritone that was a pale imitation of his father's. "We were worried about you, all alone in this big house. We thought we could help." "Help with what, dear?" I asked, my voice tired. "With the paperwork?" Isabel said, stepping forward. She was the softer of the two, her manipulations always wrapped in a veneer of caring. "Dad's study, it must be so overwhelming for you, all those files, the documents. We thought we could help you sort through it all, find the will, get things in order." The thought of them in Richard's study felt like a violation. It was his sanctuary, a room of dark wood, worn leather, and the lingering scent of his cigars. It was the brain of our entire life, and the thought of their hands, my children's hands, sifting through it, it felt wrong. A cold dread, sharp and unwelcome, uncoiled in my stomach. But what could I say? To refuse their help would be to seem ungrateful, suspicious. And besides, I was so tired. The weight of my grief was a physical thing, and the thought of facing that room alone was, as they'd said, overwhelming. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said, forcing a weak smile. They took that as their cue. Their energy was brisk, efficient. They were no longer grieving children. They were corporate raiders, securing an acquisition. They walked into the study, and I followed, a silent ghost in their wake. For the next hour, I watched them dismantle my husband's life with a chilling lack of sentiment. Ethan went straight for the filing cabinets, his fingers rifling through folders, muttering about stock certificates and property deeds. Isabel started on the desk, creating neat, sterile piles. Personal correspondence in one, business in another. A small, framed photo of our wedding day was glanced at and then placed face down in a box she had labeled miscellaneous. I just sat in Richard's armchair in the corner, a silent observer, feeling a growing sense of profound unease. This wasn't help. This was an audit. "Here it is," Ethan finally said, his voice laced with a triumph he barely tried to conceal. He pulled a thick, cream-colored envelope from the back of the bottom filing drawer, from the place Richard had always kept our most important documents, the last will and testament of Richard A. Vance. He placed it on the center of the desk with a sense of finality. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken anticipation. It was the culmination of their entire lives, the final accounting of their birthright. And it was in that moment that Isabel performed her part of the duet. She was going through a drawer of Richard's personal effects. "Oh, Mother, look at this," she said, her voice suddenly soft and nostalgic. She pulled out a small, leather-bound photo album. Is this our first family trip to the lake house?" She brought it over to me, her eyes glistening with what, for a moment, looked like real tears. She sat on the arm of my chair, and together we turned the fragile black paper pages. There we were, so young. A smiling Richard holding a tiny, squirming Ethan. Me, trying to put a sun hat on a toddler Isabel. For a few precious seconds, the cold, calculating adults in the room disappeared, and they were just my children again. The grief I had been holding back washed over me, raw and powerful. "He loved that lake house," I whispered, my finger tracing the outline of my husband's young, happy face. "He did," Isabel said softly, squeezing my shoulder. It was a perfect, masterful diversion. From the corner of my eye, I was vaguely aware of movement at the desk. I heard the soft click of a different drawer opening, a slight rustle of paper, and then the quiet, definitive click of the drawer closing again. I didn't think anything of it. My attention was on the past, on the smiling ghosts in the photograph. "Well," Isabel said after a moment, her task complete. She stood up, her brief moment of sentimentality evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. "We should let you rest, Mother." "Yes," Ethan agreed, standing by the desk. He patted the thick, cream-colored envelope. "We found what we were looking for. We'll give this to Alistair Finch to begin the process. The reading should be next week." They left soon after, their mission accomplished. They left me sitting in the study, the old photo album still open on my lap. But the warmth of the memory was gone, replaced by that same cold, nagging sense of unease. Something felt wrong, out of place. My eyes were drawn to the will, sitting on the desk. I stood up and walked over to it. I ran my fingers over the envelope. It was the right kind of heavy paper. It had the seal of Richard's personal stationery. But something was off. The fold of the flap seemed too perfect, too crisp. Richard had always been a little clumsy with letters, always leaving a slight, endearing crease at the corner. I told myself it was nothing. I was seeing ghosts in every shadow, imagining conspiracies where there was only grief. I was just a sad, confused old woman, just as my children saw me. But as I stood there, in the profound, heavy silence of my husband's study, I could not shake the feeling that I had just been robbed. I did not yet know what had been stolen. But I knew, with the chilling certainty of a wife of 45 years, that the document they had left for me to find was not the one my husband had put there. The performance was over, and the betrayal was just beginning. For the next 2 days, I was a ghost in my own home, haunted by a single obsessive thought: the will. I would go into the study and just stare at it, lying there on the desk, a cream-colored serpent in a room full of memories. It looked so official, so final. And yet, it felt like a stranger in a familiar room. I tried to reason with myself, to dismiss the feeling as a symptom of grief. "You're being paranoid, Clara. You're exhausted. Your children are just trying to help." But the cold, hard knot of dread in my stomach only tightened. The breaking point came on the 3rd day. I was tidying up the study, unable to bear the sterile, impersonal order my children had imposed on it. I was putting Richard's personal effects back where they belonged when I noticed a small, crumpled piece of paper in the back of the wastebasket underneath some discarded tissues. It must have been missed when Isabel had so helpfully cleaned up. My fingers trembled as I smoothed it out. It was a single discarded page, torn from a legal document, and the letterhead was from our family lawyer, Alistair Finch. The page number at the bottom read, "Page 6 of 7." It was a page from a will. My eyes scanned the dense, legal text, and then one sentence leaped out at me, a sentence written in my husband's familiar, decisive language. And as such, in recognition of her 45 years as my unwavering partner in life and in business, the controlling shares of Vance Industries, totaling 51% of all voting stock, shall pass in their entirety to my beloved wife, Clara Vance. I sank into the desk chair, the crumpled paper clutched in my hand, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. This was Richard's voice. This was his will. The fierce, protective love, the formal recognition of our partnership, it was all there. I knew, with a certainty that was as absolute and terrifying as my own name, that this sentence was not in the pristine, folded document my children had found. The fog of my grief was burned away in a single, searing flash of incandescent rage. It wasn't a hot, screaming anger. It was a cold, silent fury that settled deep in my bones. They had done it. My son and my daughter, my own flesh and blood, had stood in this room, had distracted their grieving mother with old photographs, and had committed the most profound act of betrayal imaginable. They had stolen my husband's last words. They had tried to erase me from his legacy. I did not cry. My grief was too deep for tears now. I did not throw things. My anger was too focused for theatrics. I simply sat there, in the quiet of my husband's study, and I made a decision. I would not be a victim. I would not be the frail, confused old woman they thought I was. I was Clara Vance. I was Richard's partner, and this was not over. I looked at the phone. There was only one person in the world I could trust, one person who had known Richard not just as a CEO, but as a friend. My hand was perfectly steady as I dialed. Alistair Finch's office, a crisp, professional voice answered. "It's Clara Vance," I said, my voice low and urgent. "I need to speak with him immediately. It is a matter of the utmost urgency." Alistair was with me in less than an hour. He walked into the study, his tall, slender frame radiating an aura of calm competence. He was in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that had seen every kind of human drama imaginable. He had been Richard's lawyer, his confidant, and his closest friend since they were college roommates. He looked at my face, and his professional mask immediately softened with genuine concern. "Clara," he said, taking my hands in his. "What is it? You sound terrible." I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I simply handed him two things: the pristine, folded will my children had left on the desk, and the single crumpled page I had found in the trash. "My children helped me find this," I said, pointing to the envelope, "and I found this after they left." Alistair put on his reading glasses. He read the crumpled page first. A single sharp intake of breath was his only reaction. Then, with a grim, methodical air, he opened the main envelope and began to read the will my children had provided. He read all 7 pages. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft rustle of the heavy paper. When he was finished, he took off his glasses and placed them carefully on the desk. He looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a cold, quiet fury that mirrored my own. "It's a forgery," he said, his voice flat. "A brilliant one. They've copied the structure, the legal language, but the soul of it, the soul is gone. Richard would have sooner set his own company on fire than sign a document that left you with a mere generous allowance and stripped you of all control." He picked up the crumpled page. "This, however, this is Richard's voice. This is the will I helped him draft 5 years ago." "I knew it," I whispered, the validation a small, cold comfort. "Clara, I am so sorry," he said, his voice filled with a deep personal pain. "For Richard to be gone, and for you to have to face this monstrous betrayal from his own children." "There is no time for sorrow, Alistair," I said, my voice hard. "Only for action. What do we do?" He looked at me, a new respect dawning in his eyes. He had been expecting a grieving widow. He was finding a formidable queen. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. "Richard was many things, Clara," he said, "but a fool was not one of them. He loved his children, but he was not blind to their character flaws, their sense of entitlement. He always feared they would see his legacy as a prize to be won, not a responsibility to be carried." Alistair stood up and walked over to the large framed portrait of Richard that hung above the fireplace. "Which is why," he said, reaching behind the frame. He put a contingency plan in place. Years ago, my eyes widened as he pressed a hidden switch. A small, almost invisible section of the wood-paneled wall beside the fireplace clicked open, revealing a small, hidden safe. Alistair spun the dial with a practiced familiarity. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, Alistair continued as he worked, and if you ever called me with even the slightest suspicion about the handling of his estate, I was to open this safe. He said you had the best instincts of anyone he knew, and that I was to trust them implicitly. The heavy door of the safe swung open. Inside, there was only one item. Another thick, cream-colored envelope, identical to the first, but this one was sealed with Richard's personal red wax crest. Alistair took it out and placed it on the desk in front of me. "What is it?" I breathed. "It is Richard's true final will and testament," Alistair said. "Lodged directly with me, in a sealed container, to be opened only under these specific circumstances." He called it his fail-safe, a final test of his children's character. He tapped the envelope. "And it would appear they have failed spectacularly." I stared at the envelope, at the proud, unbroken seal. It felt like Richard was in the room with us, his strategic mind reaching out from beyond the grave to protect me one last time. The plan, my plan, began to form in that moment, clear and sharp and cold as ice. "They do not know this exists," I stated. Not a question. "No one knows but you and me," Alistair confirmed. "The reading for the other will is scheduled for next Friday." "Let it proceed," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Alistair looked at me, and a slow, wolfish grin spread across his face. He understood immediately. "Oh, Clara," he said, a note of pure, unadulterated admiration in his voice. "You truly were his partner. This is going to be a bloodbath." "No, Alistair," I corrected him, a small, cold smile touching my own lips for the first time in a week. "It's not a bloodbath. It's a board meeting, and I am about to call it to order." The week leading up to the will reading was one of the longest and most difficult of my life. It required a performance of such profound duplicity. It felt like I was an actress in a play about my own tragedy. Every morning, I had to wake up and put on the mask of the woman my children expected me to be, the broken, grieving, and utterly defeated widow. They would visit every other day, their faces a perfect blend of pity and filial concern. They brought me meals in plastic containers, fussed over my apparent lack of appetite, and spoke to me in the slow, simple tones one uses for a child or a person of diminished capacity. "Now, Mother," Isabel would say, her voice syrupy sweet as she rearranged the pillows on my sofa. "Have you taken your sleeping pills? You need your rest. Don't you worry about a thing. Ethan and I are handling everything." Everything. The word was a dagger. They were handling my finances, fielding calls from my friends, making decisions about Richard's estate. They moved through my life with the confident air of new owners, rearranging the furniture of my world to better suit themselves. And all the while, I had to sit there, my hands clasped in my lap, and look grateful. I had to appear weak, confused, and overwhelmed. I had to let them believe they had won. The hardest part was the conversations about the will. Alistair Finch confirmed the reading for Friday, Ethan announced one afternoon, sitting in Richard's armchair as if it were his own throne. "It will be at his office. Just a formality, really. It's all very straightforward." He looked at me, a flicker of something guilt, or perhaps just annoyance at having to go through the motions. Crossed his face. "Don't worry, Mother. As we said, we'll make sure you're taken care of. A very generous monthly allowance will be set up for you. You won't have to worry about managing the complexities of the estate anymore." The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it almost made me break character. To sit there and be told I would be given an allowance from my own fortune, from the empire I had helped build, was a test of every ounce of my self-control. I wanted to tell him that I had forgotten more about managing complex estates than he had ever learned. But instead, I just looked down at my hands, made them tremble slightly, and whispered, That's very kind of you, dear." My performance was, I must admit, flawless. I was so convincing in my role as the fragile matriarch that they grew bolder, more confident, their guard completely down. They would have loud, whispered conversations on their phones in the next room, assuming I couldn't hear or wouldn't understand. I heard them discussing which properties to liquidate first. I heard Isabel planning a lavish kitchen renovation for her house, my house. I heard Ethan talking to a broker about a new sports car he planned to buy the day after the will was probated. Each word was a fresh log on the fire of my cold, burning rage. But I showed them nothing. My face was a mask of placid, sorrowful acceptance. In the evenings, after they had left, the real Clara would emerge. I would go to my study, lock the door, and have my nightly strategy call with Alistair. "They're treating me like a porcelain doll," I told him one night, my voice laced with a weariness that was not an act. "They think my brain has turned to dust along with my heart." "Let them," Alistair's voice came through the phone, grim and satisfied. "Pride is the downfall of every second-rate tyrant, Clara. Their arrogance is our greatest weapon. Let them walk into that room on Friday believing they are inheriting a kingdom. The fall will be that much greater." We spent hours going over the details. The real will, Richard's failsafe, was a work of strategic genius. It was not a simple document. It was a fortress, built of legal clauses and binding stipulations that were utterly ironclad. Richard had anticipated every possible angle of attack, every loophole, and at its heart was a letter. A final letter from him to his children, to be read aloud. Alistair had read it to me over the phone, and I had wept. Not with sadness, but with a profound, aching love for the man who had known, even in life, that he would need to protect me after his death. The day before the reading, Isabel came over with a box. "I brought you something to wear for tomorrow, Mother," she said. It was a simple, black, high-necked dress. It was the kind of dress a woman wears when she has accepted her place as a relic, a dowager in the background of someone else's life. It was a costume for the role they had assigned me. "It's beautiful, dear," I said, my voice soft. "Thank you." She smiled, a triumphant, final little smile. She believed she had won. She had dressed me for my own funeral. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in the dark of my living room, the silent house, a witness to my vigil. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was simply ready. I thought of Richard, of our long life together. I thought of the company we had built, the legacy we had created. It was not a legacy of money. It was a legacy of partnership, of respect. A legacy my children had tried to desecrate. Tomorrow, I would reclaim it. The next morning, I did not put on the black dress Isabel had brought me. Instead, I went to my closet and chose my own armor. I chose a beautifully tailored silk blouse in a soft, cream color. I clasped Richard's favorite double strand of pearls around my neck, and as I looked at myself in the mirror, I did not see a grieving widow. I saw a queen, preparing to walk into her throne room and depose the usurpers. When Julian, my son, arrived to drive me to the lawyer's office, he actually recoiled slightly. "Mother, you look formidable." I allowed myself a small, real smile. "I feel it," I said. Alistair Finch's law office was a place of old money and quiet, unshakable power. The conference room was paneled in dark, rich mahogany, the air thick with the scent of leather and aged paper. A long, polished table reflected the somber gray light from the tall windows overlooking the city. It was a room designed for the reading of fates and the dismantling of fortunes. My children were already there when I arrived. They sat on one side of the table, a united front of feigned solemnity. Ethan looked important, his jaw set, his hands steepled in front of him in a perfect imitation of his father. Isabel was the picture of gentle sorrow, dabbing at a perfectly dry eye with a silk handkerchief. They both stood as I entered, their movements a theatrical display of respect for the grieving widow. "Mother?" Ethan said, his voice a low, somber hum. "Are you ready for this?" "I am," I said, my voice quiet but clear. I took my seat at the head of the table. Alistair sat at the other end, his face an impassive mask of professional duty. The room was silent, the only sound the quiet ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. It felt like a countdown. Alistair cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the stillness. "We are gathered here today," he began, his voice formal and devoid of emotion, "to read the final will and testament of Richard Allen Vance. As per the document provided to me by the family, I will now proceed. He picked up the thick, cream-colored envelope, the forgery, from the desk in front of him. With a small, ornate letter opener, he slid it open. I watched my children. I saw the flicker of triumph in Ethan's eyes. I saw the small, self-satisfied smile that Isabel tried to hide behind her handkerchief. They thought this was it. The final, formal step in their bloodless coup. Alistair began to read. He read through the initial legal declarations, the formal bequests to a few distant relatives and charities. My children sat through it with an air of bored patience, waiting for the main event. And now, Alistair said, his voice dropping slightly, we come to the primary articles of the estate. He read the article that bequeathed Richard's classic car collection to Ethan. He read the one that left his art collection to Isabel. These were small, sentimental items, bones thrown to them to make the document seem authentic. And now, for the disposition of all remaining assets, Alistair continued, his eyes fixed on the page, including all properties, stocks, bonds, and controlling interest in Vance Industries. The air in the room grew thick. This was the moment. I, Richard Vance, Alistair read, his voice a steady, dispassionate drone, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath the entirety of my remaining estate, in equal shares, to my two beloved children, Ethan Richard Vance and Isabel Clara Vance. He paused. Ethan let out a slow, quiet breath he had clearly been holding. Isabel closed her eyes for a moment, a perfect picture of humble gratitude. Alistair continued. To my beloved wife Clara, who I know will be well cared for by our children, I leave my sincerest love and gratitude. It is my express wish that my children provide her with a generous monthly allowance from the estate, sufficient to cover all her needs for the remainder of her life, so that she need not be burdened with the complexities of managing such a vast fortune. The words were so perfectly crafted, so insidiously brilliant in their cruelty. They didn't just disinherit me. They did it under the guise of protecting me. They had used my husband's own voice to declare me incompetent. The reading was over. Alistair placed the document on the table. For a long, heavy moment, no one spoke. Then, Ethan cleared his throat. He reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. His touch was cold. Don't worry, Mother, he said, his voice oozing with a condescending sincerity that made my skin crawl. We will take care of you. You will want for nothing. We'll make sure you're very comfortable. Of course we will, Isabel added, her voice trembling with false emotion. This is what Dad would have wanted, for us to take care of you, to take the burden off your shoulders. They were celebrating, not with champagne and cheers, but with this quiet, patronizing display of power. They were the new heads of the family. I was now a dependent, a pensioner living on their charity. Their faces were aglow with the thrill of their victory. They had done it. They had won. I simply looked at them. I let them have their moment. I let them bask in the warmth of their greed and their success. I watched as they exchanged a small, triumphant glance, a silent confirmation of their shared victory. I had to give them credit. It was a perfect plan. It was a brilliant forgery. They had thought of everything. Well, almost everything. I slowly turned my gaze from my children to the man at the other end of the table. I looked at Alistair Finch. I gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. And the real performance began. Alistair Finch, receiving my silent command, cleared his throat. It was not a nervous cough. It was a sound of profound, theatrical authority, designed to shatter the comfortable silence of my children's victory. Ethan and Isabel both looked up, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and confusion. The proceedings were over. What more was there to say? Thank you all for your patience, Alistair said, his voice now imbued with a new, sharp and commanding tone. The impassive lawyer was gone. In his place was Richard Vance's oldest and most loyal friend. That concludes the reading of the document provided by Mr. and Miss Vance. He paused, letting the implication of his words hang in the air. He then reached down into his leather briefcase, which had been sitting untouched at his feet. When his hand emerged, it was holding another, identical, cream-colored envelope. But this one was sealed with a heavy, unbroken, and very familiar red wax crest. However, he continued, his voice resonating with a grim theatrical power, We now come to the matter of my late client's final, and, as stipulated in this binding document, only valid testament. He placed the second envelope on the center of the table. It landed with a soft but definitive thud that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. The color drained from Ethan's face. "What is this, Alistair?" he demanded, his voice suddenly losing its smooth, confident baritone. "What is that? We found the will. That was it." "What you found, Ethan," Alistair replied, his eyes cold as ice, "was what your father intended for you to find, should you go looking for something that was not yours to take. This," he said, tapping the sealed envelope, "is what he left for his wife." Isabel let out a small, strangled gasp. This is ridiculous! It's a trick!" "I assure you, it is not," Alistair said. "This document was lodged with me, under seal, 5 years ago, with the explicit written instruction that it was to supersede any and all other documents, and was to be opened and read only in the event that the primary will was compromised, or, in this case, replaced with a rather clumsy forgery." He broke the red wax seal. The small cracking sound was the loudest thing I had ever heard. He withdrew a sheaf of papers and a smaller, personal envelope. "Before I read the will itself," he announced, "my client left a final letter, to be read aloud, to his children." He opened the letter. The room was now thick with the stench of my children's panic. They were staring at the letter as if it were a loaded gun pointed directly at their hearts. Alistair began to read Richard's last words. "My dearest Ethan and Isabel," he began, his voice softening as he channeled his old friend. "If you are hearing these words, then it means my greatest fear has come to pass. It means that in the wake of my death, you saw not a family to be comforted, but an estate to be conquered. You saw your mother not as a grieving partner to be protected, but as an obstacle to be managed." Isabel began to sob, but they were not tears of remorse. They were the panicked tears of a fraud who had been caught. "I gave you every advantage in life," Alistair continued reading. "Every comfort, every opportunity. I did so, hoping to build a foundation upon which you could construct lives of meaning and integrity. It is the single greatest failure of my life that I seem to have built you a gilded cage instead, one that has trapped you in a prison of your own entitlement." Ethan shot to his feet. "This is an outrage. My father would never." "Sit down, Ethan," I said. It was the first time I had spoken. My voice was not loud, but it cut through his outburst like a shard of glass. He looked at me, truly looked at me, and in my eyes he did not see his frail, grieving mother. He saw the woman who had co-founded his father's empire. He sat down. Alistair continued, "This was my final test. The forged will was a trap, baited with the entirety of my fortune. I prayed you would see it, that you would alert Alistair, that you would protect your mother and honor my memory. I prayed you would prove me wrong. It is the last and most profound disappointment of my life that you have proven me right. You do not have the character to lead this family. You do not have the wisdom to manage this estate. And so, by the terms of this, my final and only binding will, you shall have neither." Alistair put the letter down. He picked up the will. He looked directly at my children, his face a mask of cold, legal finality. "I, Richard Allen Vance, do hereby render all previous testaments null and void. All articles within are final." He cleared his throat. Article 1. All personal effects, properties, stocks, bonds, and any and all other assets are to be consolidated into a single trust, to be known as the Vance Family Trust. He paused. Article 2. The sole executor and sole unmitigated beneficiary of this trust, with absolute and total control over all its assets and disbursements, is to be my beloved wife and most trusted partner, Clara Vance. The silence was a living thing. My children sat there, frozen, their faces pale, grayish masks of shock and utter ruin. But the will wasn't finished. There was one final, brilliant, and devastatingly cruel masterstroke. Article 3. Alistair read, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. My children, Ethan and Isabel, are to be granted an opportunity. They are to be given a monthly allowance, sufficient to cover basic living expenses, to be disbursed at the sole discretion of the trustee, Clara Vance. Furthermore, Their continued employment within Vance Industries and any future inheritance will be subject to a yearly performance review conducted by the trustee to assess their growth in character, humility, and respect. In short, Alistair summarized, looking up from the page, your future and your inheritance is now entirely in your mother's hands. It was over. They had not just been disinherited, they had been demoted. They were no longer heirs to a fortune, they were probationary employees in the empire of the mother they had tried to dethrone. Ethan looked like he was going to be physically ill. Isabel was staring at me, her eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of hatred and, for the first time, fear. I stood up. I was no longer the defendant in the room. I was the judge. I looked at my children, the architects of their own destruction. My first act as trustee, I announced, my voice ringing with a quiet, unshakable authority, is to call an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. The topic will be a full review of all executive positions and salaries. Ethan, Isabel, I expect you both to be there, and I expect you to be prepared to justify your value to this company. I then turned to my lawyer, my friend. Alistair, I said, thank you. You have honored my husband's memory with integrity. It was my absolute pleasure, Madam Chairman, he replied, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. I walked towards the door, not looking back at the wreckage of my children's greed. As I opened it, I paused and looked over my shoulder. Oh, and children, I said, my voice sweet as honey, cold as ice. About your allowance? We'll start you off at minimum wage. We'll see how your performance review goes. And with that, I walked out of the dark, wood-paneled office and into the bright, clear light of my new life. I had walked in as a grieving widow. I was walking out as the undisputed, absolute, and powerful head of the Vance family. The work was just beginning.